Clara May Sutton stood before the blind rancher in her wedding dress, all 400 pounds of her trembling, as Pastor Williams read the vows, while the entire town watched in stunned silence. The same townsfolk who had mocked her for years, declaring no man would ever want her. The heavy church doors crashed open with such force that the stained glass windows rattled in their frames, and every head in the packed congregation turned to see Morrison stride down the aisle like a man on a mission of righteous fury, his expensive boots clicking against the wooden floor with each determined step. Clara May felt her heart plummet as the wealthy cattleman pointed an accusing finger directly at her, his face red with what looked like genuine concern, but what she suspected was more likely wounded pride that a woman he had once mockingly called unmarriageable was standing at the altar in a white dress. "This is a farce," Morrison bellowed, his voice echoing off the chapel walls as he approached the altar where she stood frozen beside Ezra. "And you all know it because this poor blind man is being taken advantage of by a woman so desperate for marriage that she would prey upon his affliction." The whispers started immediately, rippling through the congregation like wind through wheat, and Clara May caught fragments of the cruel words she had heard all her life about her size, her unmarriageable state, and now, adding to her shame, accusations of deception and manipulation. She felt her massive frame begin to tremble, not from the weight of standing, but from the crushing humiliation of having her greatest fear realized on what should have been her happiest day, when suddenly Ezra stepped forward with such confidence that no one would have guessed he could not see the man confronting them. "I have made my choice with full knowledge, Mr. Morrison," Ezra said, his voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that comes from a man who has faced real hardship and emerged stronger, "and I will thank you to either sit down or leave my wedding." The church fell so into his words, the kind of thick silence that precedes a storm, as Morrison stood there, with his mouth working like a landed fish, clearly unprepared for such a direct response from the man he had expected to cower in confusion. Clara May watched through tears she refused to let fall as her intended husband reached out with uncanny accuracy to find her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers in a gesture of solidarity that spoke louder than any words could have. The congregation watched this display with a mixture of shock, curiosity, and in some cases, a dawning respect for the blind rancher who had chosen the woman everyone else had rejected, though Clara May could still feel the weight of their judgment pressing down on her like a physical thing. Morrison finally found his voice again, sputtering about protecting innocent folks from confidence schemes, but Pastor Williams cleared his throat and reminded everyone present that this was a house of God where such disruptions would not be tolerated, and that unless Morrison had legal grounds to object to this union, he needed to take his seat immediately. The moment stretched taut as Morrison glared at them all before finally stalking to an empty pew, his protest lodged but ineffective, leaving Clara May to wonder not for the first time what had possessed Ezra Hawthorne to choose her above all others. And now's the time to stop and subscribe to our channel. Every subscriber brings us closer to 1,000, which helps us keep these stories alive and coming your way. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see how far these tales travel across the world. Now let's continue. The wagon rolled steadily along the rutted trail leading away from town, and Clara May found herself alone with her new husband for the first time since their disrupted ceremony, the silence between them filled only with the creaking of wheels and the steady clip-clop of hooves on packed earth. She studied Ezra from the corner of her eye as he handled the reins with surprising confidence, his unseeing eyes fixed straight ahead while his other senses clearly compensated for what he had lost, and she gathered her courage to speak when he broke the silence first. "I suppose you are wondering how a blind man manages a ranch and why he would choose a bride he has never seen," he said with a slight smile that transformed his weathered features into something almost boyish, despite the lines that spoke of hard living and loss. Clara May felt her cheeks burn at his directness, but found herself responding honestly that she had wondered both things but had been too afraid to ask, fearing the answers might reveal this whole marriage to be some cruel joke or desperate arrangement. Ezra nodded thoughtfully before explaining that 3 years ago he had been working a silver claim in the mountains, when a poorly placed dynamite charge brought the tunnel down on him and several other miners, and while he survived when others did not, the rock dust and damage had stolen his sight completely within weeks of the accident. The matter-of-fact way he described such a life-altering tragedy made Clara May's heart ache, but before she could express sympathy, he continued with the real revelation that would change everything she thought she knew about their arrangement. "You used to read to me at the general store," he said quietly, "when I first returned to town and was learning to navigate without my eyes, and you were the only person who spoke to me like I was still a whole man instead of some broken thing to be pitied or avoided." Clara May remembered those afternoons now with startling clarity. How she had found him sitting alone on the store porch and had simply begun reading aloud from whatever book or newspaper was handy, not out of pity, but from her own understanding of loneliness and isolation. "You never asked permission or made a fuss," Ezra continued. "Just sat there reading in that beautiful voice of yours. And when I thanked you that first time, you said that everyone deserved to hear the news and stories, and you never once mentioned my blindness or acted like you were doing charity work." The wagon crested a small rise, and Clara May gasped at the sight of his ranch spread out before them in the valley below, the buildings well maintained and the fences straight and true, the gardens neat, and the entire operation showing signs of careful management that seemed impossible for a sightless man to achieve alone. "I chose you," Ezra said simply, as they descended toward what would be her new home, "because in all those afternoons of reading and conversation you saw me more clearly than anyone with working eyes ever has, and I knew that a woman with that kind of vision would make the truest partner a man could hope for." Clara May had been unpacking her few belongings in the surprisingly spacious bedroom when the leather journal slipped from between her folded clothes and hit the wooden floor with a distinctive thud that seemed to echo through the quiet house like a gunshot. She froze as she heard Ezra's footsteps approaching from the hallway, her heart racing as she scrambled to retrieve the journal that contained her most closely guarded secret. But his uncanny ability to navigate by sound brought him to the doorway before she could hide the evidence of her hidden life. "What was that sound?" he asked with gentle curiosity rather than suspicion. And Clara May found herself unable to lie to this man who had already shown her more trust than anyone else in her life, so she admitted it was just a book that had fallen while she was unpacking. Ezra entered the room with the same confident movements he displayed everywhere in his domain and knelt beside her, his hands finding the journal before she could think of a reasonable way to stop him without seeming suspicious. And his sensitive fingers immediately detected something unusual about the pages. "These pages are thick with raised ink," he said with growing interest as his fingers traced over the careful drawings she had made over the years. "And from the patterns I can feel these are detailed illustrations of some kind. Perhaps botanical drawings from the way the lines suggest leaves and stems and flower petals." Clara May felt tears spring to her eyes as he explored her work with such care and interest rather than mockery, and she found herself confessing that yes, they were drawings of medicinal plants she had been documenting for the past 5 years, ever since she had begun teaching herself about herbal remedies. The confession seemed to open a floodgate within her, as she explained how her mother had fallen ill with a wasting disease that the town doctor had declared hopeless, charging money they did not have for treatments that did nothing but make her mother weaker and more miserable with each passing day. "I started reading everything I could find about plant medicines," she whispered, remembering those desperate nights spent poring over borrowed books by candlelight, "and I began experimenting with different combinations of herbs and roots that grew wild in the hills around town, documenting everything that helped ease her pain or gave her peaceful sleep." Ezra's hands had stilled on the journal pages as he listened. His face turned toward her with such focused attention that she could almost forget he could not see the shame and fear written across her features as she revealed the depths of her secret studies. She explained how she had helped her mother live 2 years longer than the doctor predicted, not curing her, but giving her comfort and dignity in her final days, and how she had continued her studies afterward, helping others quietly when she could, but never revealing the source of the remedies. "I never told anyone, because a woman my size studying plants and medicines would have been laughed out of town," she said, the old pain fresh in her voice as she remembered the cruel comments about her body and worth, and that they would have said I was trying to play at being something I could never be, just another desperate attempt to make myself useful enough that someone might overlook my appearance. 3 days after Clara May had revealed her botanical journals to Ezra, the sound of multiple horses approaching the ranch made them both freeze at the breakfast table, and when she peered through the kitchen window, her heart sank to see Morrison riding up with his 2 adult sons, their faces set in expressions that promised trouble. Ezra stood slowly from the table, his jaw tight with attention, as he explained that Morrison had been pressuring him for months about a cattle deal from before his accident, claiming money was owed despite Ezra having no memories of such an arrangement, and now it seemed the man was ready to escalate his demands. Morrison did not bother with pleasantries when Clara May opened the door, pushing past her substantial frame as if she were nothing more than furniture while his sons positioned themselves strategically on the porch, making it clear this was not a social visit but something far more threatening. "I have been patient long enough, Hawthorne," Morrison announced as he threw a leather folder onto the kitchen table. "And these documents clearly show you owe me $5,000 for cattle purchased before your accident, plus interest that has been accumulating these 3 years." Clara May watched Ezra's hands find the papers with practiced ease, his fingers running over them as if he could read the ink through touch alone. But she picked them up herself and began examining them with the careful attention to detail that her botanical studies had taught her. The letterhead looked official enough at first glance, but as she studied the supposed contract more closely, she noticed inconsistencies in the ink colour and paper quality that suggested different parts had been written at different times, and the date at the top corresponded to a time when Ezra had already been recovering from his accident. "These papers are forgeries," she said firmly, her voice cutting through Morrison's bluster as she pointed out the discrepancies to Ezra, explaining how the signature had been traced rather than naturally written, and how the terms reference cattle prices that did not match the market values from 3 years ago. Morrison's face darkened dangerously as he stepped closer to her, using his height to try to intimidate her, despite her own substantial size, and when he spoke his voice carried the kind of casual cruelty that came from years of getting his way through fear and influence. "No judge in this territory will believe a blind man and his desperate bride over me," he said with a cold smile that made her skin crawl. "Especially when everyone knows how eager you were to marry anyone who would have you, and how convenient it is that you suddenly found these supposed forgeries right after getting access to his property." The threat hung in the air between them like a physical presence, made worse by the realization that struck both Clara May and Ezra simultaneously as they noticed the unusual quiet around the ranch, the absence of the usual sounds of ranch hands going about their morning chores. "Your workers seem to have all decided to take the day off," Morrison continued with false casualness. "Funny how that happens sometimes when men realize they might be working for the losing side in a dispute, leaving you two all alone to think about my generous offer to settle this debt by signing over half your ranch." After Morrison and his sons departed with their 3-day ultimatum hanging over the ranch like a storm cloud, Clara May transformed the kitchen table into a battlefield of papers and documents, determined to find the evidence that would expose his schemes and save their home. She began by creating a system that would allow Ezra to participate fully in their investigation, using drops of warm wax to create raised dots and patterns on important documents, developing a code where 1 dot meant signatures, 2 dots indicated dates, and 3 dots marked suspicious sections that needed closer examination. Working through the night by the lamplight, she read aloud every contract and letter in Ezra's files while he sat beside her with his remarkable memory serving as a living index, recalling conversations and business dealings that helped her piece together the pattern of deception that went far deeper than just their situation. As the hours passed and the evidence mounted, Clara May discovered that Morrison had been systematically targeting men who had been disabled in mining accidents or during military service, using their perceived vulnerability to steal property and assets through forged documents and intimidation. The proof was scattered across dozens of seemingly unrelated papers, but when assembled properly it painted a picture of calculated predation, with Morrison approaching each victim when they were most vulnerable and alone, counting on society's dismissal of disabled men to protect him from consequences. "You see more truth than any sighted man in this town," Clara May declared, as she watched Ezra's face harden with righteous anger at each new revelation. "Your blindness has become Morrison's weakness because he never imagined you would keep such careful records or have someone willing to help you fight back." Together they identified 5 other victims, including 2 veterans who had lost legs in the Indian Wars and another blind miner who had supposedly sold his claim for a fraction of its value, each transaction bearing the same suspicious hallmarks of Morrison's forgeries. Ezra's contribution proved invaluable as he recalled overheard conversations and seemingly innocent comments that now took on sinister meaning, his memory providing context that transformed Clara May's documentary findings into a comprehensive case against their tormentor. She developed a filing system using different textures of fabric glued to folders, allowing Ezra to identify documents by touch, while she created detailed written summaries of each piece of evidence, their partnership evolving from necessity into something approaching dance as they worked in harmony. The second night found them still working, surrounded by growing piles of evidence as Morrison's deadline crept closer, But Clara May felt a fierce joy in using her analytical skills for something vital, her years of careful botanical documentation having trained her to spot patterns others might miss. By dawn of the third day, they had assembled proof of Morrison's crimes that would be difficult for any honest judge to ignore, including a letter from one victim who had written to a relative before his mysterious death, describing Morrison's threats in detail. Clara May looked at her exhausted husband with pride and determination, knowing that together they had built something Morrison had never expected to face, a case constructed by the very people he had dismissed as worthless, prepared with the meticulous care of those who knew they would get only one chance at justice. The sound of horses approaching on the morning of the third day made Clara May's stomach clench with anticipation, but she forced herself to remain calm as she saw Morrison riding up with Sheriff Patterson, a man known more for avoiding conflict than resolving it, clearly expecting this to be a simple eviction of two people who could not prove their claims. Morrison dismounted with the swagger of a man certain of victory, his broad smile faltering only slightly when he saw Clara May and Ezra waiting on the porch with a table laid out with documents, her botanical journal prominently displayed among the papers like a weapon waiting to be deployed. Sheriff Patterson looked uncomfortable as he approached, clearly having been told this would be a straightforward collection of debt, but his expression began to change as Clara May calmly presented her evidence. Starting with the forged documents and their telltale inconsistencies, she opened her botanical journal to pages dated 3 years prior, showing detailed drawings of plants found only in specific locations, with notes about weather conditions and seasonal changes that proved beyond doubt where Ezra had been during the time Morrison claimed the cattle deal had occurred. The sheriff's eyes widened as she showed him entry after entry that placed Ezra 20 miles away in the mountains during the supposed transaction, her meticulous documentation of gathering medicinal herbs inadvertently creating an unshakable alibi that no forger could have anticipated. Morrison began to bluster and rage about accepting the word of a desperate woman, but his protest died in his throat when Ezra reached under the table and produced a wooden box containing a phonograph cylinder, explaining that he had begun recording important conversations after losing his sight as a way to preserve details he might forget. The scratchy recording filled the air with Morrison's own voice from 3 days prior, his threats and admissions captured with mechanical precision, including his boast about running off the ranch hands and his crude comments about how no judge would believe a blind man and his fat wife over him. Sheriff Patterson's face had gone from skeptical to shocked as the evidence mounted, and when Clara May presented the additional proof of Morrison's other victims, including the letter from the dead veteran describing identical schemes, the lawman finally straightened his spine and turned to Morrison with the first sign of real authority he had shown. "This is fraud and extortion on a scale I have never seen," Patterson said slowly, his hand moving to rest on his pistol as he realized the kind of man he was dealing with, "and I will need you to come with me to town while we sort through these allegations properly." Morrison's face went through a series of transformations from disbelief to rage to something like panic as he realized his carefully constructed schemes were collapsing, and in that moment of desperation his hand suddenly dove for the gun at his hip, drawing it with the speed of a man who had used violence to solve problems before. Time seemed to slow as the weapon cleared leather, Morrison's eyes wild with the particular madness that comes when powerful men realize they have lost everything, the barrel swinging between the sheriff and Clara May as he tried to decide which threat to eliminate first. Without conscious thought or hesitation, Clara May moved her substantial body directly between Morrison and her husband, her 400 pounds creating a wall of flesh and determination that made Morrison's gun waver as he realized the complexity of his tactical situation. "You will have to shoot through me first, and even you are not that good a shot," she said with a calmness that surprised everyone, including herself, her voice carrying the kind of steel that comes from finally understanding that the very thing society had mocked her for could become her greatest asset in protecting those she loved. Morrison's face contorted with rage and disbelief as he found himself confronted not by a cowering victim, but by a woman whose size made her an impossible target to shoot around, and his gun hand began to shake as he realized that murdering a woman in front of the sheriff would destroy any chance of talking his way out of this situation. Behind her, Clara May could feel Ezra's presence, his hand reaching for her arm, not to pull her back but to steady himself, trusting her completely to be his shield just as he had trusted her with his business and his heart, and that trust gave her a strength that had nothing to do with physical size. Morrison looked desperately toward his sons who had remained mounted during the confrontation, clearly expecting them to intervene on his behalf, but both young men sat frozen in their saddles with expressions of growing horror as they realized the extent of their father's crimes laid out in the documents on the table. "Pa," the elder son said slowly, his voice thick with disgust and disappointment, "you told us these were legitimate business deals, but this evidence shows you have been stealing from blind men and war veterans using forged papers and threats." The younger son dismounted and walked deliberately to stand beside Sheriff Patterson, his choice of sides clear as he stated that he would testify to everything he had witnessed today and other suspicious dealings he had observed but never questioned until now. Morrison's world crumbled visibly as his own blood turned against him, the gun in his hand becoming less a weapon and more a symbol of his complete isolation, while Clara May stood firm as a mountain between him and any possibility of escape through violence. Sheriff Patterson found his courage in Clara May's example and drew his own weapon with steady hands, ordering Morrison to drop his gun immediately or face the consequences, and the standoff stretched taut with Clara May at its centre, like a lighthouse standing against a storm. The transformation was complete as she felt the power in her body that had nothing to do with conventional beauty and everything to do with purpose, her size becoming a gift that allowed her to protect the man who had seen her true worth when everyone else saw only her weight. Morrison's gun finally lowered, and then dropped to the ground as he realized he was beaten not by force but by the courage of a woman he had dismissed as desperate and worthless. His empire of fraud destroyed by the very people he had considered too damaged to fight back. Clara May remained standing guard over her husband until Sheriff Patterson had Morrison in irons, her body a testament to the fact that strength comes in many forms, and that true courage is standing up for those you love regardless of what weapons are pointed at you. Sheriff Patterson clicked the iron manacles around Morrison's wrists with a satisfaction that seemed to ripple through the gathered crowd, as word of the confrontation had spread quickly and brought townspeople who had never before ventured to Ezra's remote ranch, all drawn by the extraordinary news that someone had finally stood up to the powerful cattleman. Within hours of Morrison's arrest, other victims began arriving at the ranch like pilgrims to a shrine, men who had suffered in silence now finding courage in Clara May's example, including the 2 war veterans who walked with crutches and another blind miner who wept openly as he described how Morrison had stolen his life's work. The sheriff took statement after statement while Clara May served coffee and biscuits to the growing crowd, her movements confident and graceful despite her size as she finally understood that her worth had nothing to do with her weight and everything to do with her character. Ezra stood beside her throughout the proceedings, his hand occasionally finding hers in gestures of support that did not go unnoticed by the townspeople who had gathered, many of whom were seeing their marriage with new eyes now that the dramatic events had stripped away their preconceptions. As the afternoon wore on and the full scope of Morrison's crimes became clear, Ezra asked for silence and then spoke directly to the assembled crowd with a clarity and conviction that commanded their complete attention. "I need you all to understand something about my wife," he began, his unseeing eyes somehow managing to sweep across the gathering in a way that made each person feel addressed personally, because there have been whispers and assumptions about our marriage that do dishonour to the finest woman I have ever known. He explained how Clara May had read to him at the general store during his darkest days after the accident, never asking permission or making him feel like a charity case, just sharing her voice and presence with a generosity that had slowly healed parts of him that had nothing to do with his lost sight. "I fell in love with your voice first," he said, while turning toward Clara May with unerring accuracy, reading those stories and newspapers with such life and warmth that the words became pictures in my mind, and your size never mattered to me because your soul filled every room you entered, with kindness and intelligence. The crowd listened in rapt silence as he described discovering her botanical journals and understanding the depth of learning and compassion she had hidden from a world that judged her only by her appearance, and how her courage in facing down Morrison had merely confirmed what he already knew about her extraordinary character. Clara May felt tears streaming down her face as the man she had married for companionship revealed the depth of his genuine love, while around them the townspeople began to shift uncomfortably as they recognized their own prejudices reflected in his words. The moment became a kind of public redemption as several women approached Clara May with apologies for years of snubs and whispered cruelties, while men shook Ezra's hand with a newfound respect that had nothing to do with pity and everything to do with recognizing a man who saw more clearly than those with perfect vision. 6 months after Morrison's arrest and the revelation of his crimes against the vulnerable citizens of the territory, Clara May stood in the morning sun surveying her medicinal garden that now stretched across 2 full acres of what had once been unused land beside the main house. The neat rows of feverfew, willowbark, echinacea, and dozens of other healing plants represented not just her personal vindication, but a transformation of the entire ranch into something more than either she or Ezra had imagined possible when they first joined their lives together. The ranch itself had prospered under their joint management, with Clara May's careful documentation skills and botanical knowledge combining with Ezra's deep understanding of cattle and land to create innovations that neighbouring ranchers soon began copying, such as her discovery that certain plants grown near water sources could prevent the spread of disease among the herds. 3 of the original ranch hands had returned just a month after Morrison's downfall, hat in hand and shame-faced as they admitted their cowardice in abandoning Ezra when Morrison had threatened them. And Clara May had surprised them by accepting their apologies with grace, while making it clear that such betrayal would not be tolerated again. The most remarkable change, however, was the steady stream of women who now made the journey to the ranch, seeking Clara May's knowledge about herbal remedies, wives and mothers who had heard about the woman who had documented cures and treatments that actually worked when the expensive tonics from town doctors failed. She taught them in the large kitchen that had become a sort of informal classroom, showing them how to identify plants, prepare tinctures, and most importantly how to document their findings in journals like the one that had helped save Ezra's ranch from Morrison's schemes. The sheriff had become a regular visitor, bringing his wife who suffered from persistent headaches that Clara May's feverfew preparations eased better than any patent medicine, and his presence lent official approval to what might otherwise have been dismissed as dangerous female meddling in the realm of medicine. Ezra moved through it all with a confidence that had grown alongside their success, his blindness no longer a limitation, but simply another aspect of their partnership as he used his acute hearing and memory to help Clara May organise her teaching sessions and manage the growing complexity of their operation. The transformation in how the town viewed them was perhaps the most profound change of all, as the woman once mocked for her size and the man once pitied for his blindness had become an example of what true partnership could achieve when built on mutual respect and genuine affection. Young couples now sought their advice on marriage, while older residents admitted privately that they had been wrong to judge Clara May by her appearance, or to assume Ezra's disability made him less capable of choosing a worthy bride. By the time the first snows began to dust the mountains that formed the backdrop to their thriving ranch, Clara May and Ezra had created something that neither Morrison's schemes nor society's prejudices had been able to prevent: a life built on love, trust, and the revolutionary idea that worth had nothing to do with what others could see and everything to do with what 2 people could build together. On a perfect spring morning, exactly 1 year after their first ceremony had been interrupted by Morrison's accusations, Clara May and Ezra stood together in the medicinal garden that had become the heart of their transformed ranch, with only Pastor Williams present to witness what they considered their true wedding. The garden bloomed around them in a riot of colours and fragrances that Clara May described in loving detail for her husband, her voice painting pictures of the purple echinacea standing tall like royal sentinels, the white feverfew spreading like snow across the eastern beds, and the golden calendula that caught the morning sun like scattered coins. "This is our cathedral," she told Ezra as she guided his hands to touch the various plants she had cultivated, built not of stone and stained glass, but of living things that heal and nourish, just as we have healed and nourished each other through these months of building our life together. Pastor Williams smiled as he began the simple ceremony they had requested, understanding that this private moment meant more to them than any public display could, especially since the town's acceptance of their marriage remained mixed despite the dramatic vindication of Morrison's arrest and trial. Some hearts had genuinely changed after witnessing their courage and success, with several prominent families now treating Clara May with the respect she had always deserved, but others still whispered behind their hands about the strange coupling of the fat woman and the blind man, unable to see past their prejudices even when confronted with evidence of true love. Ezra took Clara May's hands in his as they prepared to speak the vows they had written together, his touch gentle but sure, as he began to speak from his heart about the woman who had transformed his isolation into partnership and his darkness into a different kind of sight. "You taught me that beauty is not what others see, but what we create together," he said. his voice strong with emotion as he continued, "And in this garden that your knowledge and care has brought to life, in the ranch that prospers under our combined efforts, in the lives we have touched by refusing to accept the limitations others would place on us, we have created something more beautiful than I ever imagined possible." Clara May felt tears sliding down her cheeks as she spoke her own vows, telling him how he had given her the courage to share her knowledge instead of hiding it, how his faith in her abilities had allowed her to bloom like the plants she tended, and how his love had shown her that her worth had nothing to do with her size and everything to do with her soul. When Pastor Williams pronounced them husband and wife for the second time, they kissed among the herbs and flowers that bore witness to their journey, while a meadowlark sang from the fence post as if nature itself was celebrating their union. As they walked back to the house hand in hand, Clara May knew that their happiness was not the fairy tale kind that came easily to beautiful people in stories, but the deeper, more lasting kind that was earned through facing adversity together and choosing love despite the odds, and that made it worth more than all the easy acceptances in the world.